$385,000. That was the number that turned my daughter's tears on, brought my son's fists out, and made my son-in-law smile at me across a cafe table like a man collecting a signature he had been chasing for weeks. My own son broke my wrist on the flagstones I had laid with my own 2 hands, and I went down the way my old rescue dog goes down, when a truck backfires out on the road, folded and flinching, and certain the next blow was already coming. He stood over me screaming that I was stealing money that belonged to him. He was wrong about the stealing, and he was 3 weeks too late. What none of them ever understood, not my daughter with her rehearsed tears, not my son with his fists, not the quiet man she married who set the whole thing in motion, was that the fortune they came to take had already been gone since before the first of them ever knocked on my door. My name is Maribel Vance. I am 66 years old, and for most of that time I have been a woman who worked with her hands. I sew. I have taken in other people's torn hems and split seams and wedding dresses that needed letting out at the last minute for as long as I can remember. And on the nights when the sewing did not pay enough, I sat up in strangers' bedrooms watching over the sick and the dying so their families could sleep. There are 2 things I learned in all those years that turned out to matter more than anything else I ever knew. I learned what a body sounds like when it is afraid the small changes in a breath, the way a voice tightens a half turn before the person even knows they are frightened. And I learned what a house sounds like at 3 in the morning, when you are the only soul awake inside it, the way the walls settle and the pipes tick, and a footstep that does not belong announces itself long before you see it. I did not know, back when I was learning those things, kneeling on bathroom floors and sitting in hard chairs beside hospital beds, that they were the very skills that would one day keep me alive. I live in a small house at the edge of a lake at the end of a gravel road that turns to soft mud every spring. It is nothing grand. There is a screened porch where I drink my coffee in the mornings, a sewing table pushed up hard against the front window so I can catch the light coming off the water, and a rescue dog named Waffle, who is mostly ears and appetite, and who has never once in his life been any use as a guard dog, though he would like you to think otherwise. My mornings had a shape to them that had not changed in years. Black coffee, no sugar. Toast with butter. Waffle fed and let out to do his business in the wet grass. Then I would sit at my table with a garment across my knees and thread between my fingers and watch the light move across the lake while the day made up its mind about what it wanted to be. It was a quiet life. It was mine. And after everything that has happened to me, I have come to understand that a quiet life is not the same thing as a small one. People who meet me now do not know that I started with nothing, and when I say nothing, I do not mean I was poor the way most people mean when they say they grew up with nothing. I was a foster child. I moved through 6 different homes before I was 12 years old, carrying everything I owned in a paper sack from one strange kitchen to the next, and I learned very early that no one was coming to save me, so I had better learn how to save myself. I will tell you a little about those 6 houses because they made me, and a person cannot understand the rest of this story without understanding the girl it happened to. The first one I do not remember because I was too small, and maybe that is a mercy. The second had a woman who meant well and a husband who did not. And I learned in that house how to be quiet, how to make myself small and still and easy to overlook, which is a skill that has kept me safe more times than I can count, and also cost me more than I will ever get back. The third house had too many children, and not enough of anything else, and I learned there that love divided too many ways stops feeling like love, and starts feeling like a line you wade in. The fourth was the one with the foster grandmother, the only one out of the 6 where a grown person ever touched my hair with any kindness in it. And she is the reason I own that rocking chair, and she died before they could place me permanently with her, and I have never fully forgiven the world for that particular piece of its arithmetic. The 5th house I ran away from, the 6th house I aged out of. Nobody threw me a party, nobody cried. A caseworker I had met exactly twice shook my hand in a parking lot and wished me luck, and got back into her car, and that was the end of my childhood in a parking lot with a handshake. And I stood there holding my duffel bag and understood that whatever happened to me next was entirely up to me, and no one else was going to be keeping track. When I aged out of the system at 18, I had one duffel bag, $41 folded into the toe of a sock, and not the faintest idea in the world where I was going to sleep that night. What I had instead of a family was a woman named Opal Merrick, a seamstress who ran a little alterations shop 2 blocks down from the group home. Opal did not owe me a thing. She had never in her life met a stranger she trusted less than a teenager with nowhere to go, and a chip on her shoulder the size of a fence post. But she took one long look at me standing in her doorway, pretending I was not scared half to death, and she said I could sweep her floors for cash until I figured something out. I never did figure something else out. I stayed. She taught me to sew a buttonhole that would outlast the shirt it was sewn onto. She taught me that a pair of skilled hands is a kind of dignity no one can ever take away from you, no matter what else they take. She gave me a trade, and more than that, she gave me a reason to believe I was worth teaching. I worked in that little shop with her for 11 years, and in all that time she never once told me she loved me because she was not a woman who was built to say a thing like that out loud. But she showed it to me in 10,000 small ways that I only came to understand the size of after she was gone. She kept a cot in the back room and never charged me $1 of rent for the years I slept on it. She fed me out of her own supper more nights than I could count, always pretending she was not very hungry that evening so that I would take the larger half without feeling like charity. She taught me that a seam sewn in a hurry always shows, and that people can tell when you have rushed them, even if they cannot say how, and that the only honest way to do a thing is to do it slow and do it right the first time. She taught me how to look at a garment somebody had worn thin and see underneath the wear exactly what it had been when it was new and how to bring that back. I have come to believe that she taught me how to look at people the very same way to see underneath the wear to the thing they had been at the start, though it took me the better part of my life to understand that lesson. And there are 1 or 2 people in my own family I am still trying to see that way even now. When she died, she left me her good shears and nothing else because she had nothing else in this world to leave. And I stood at her graveside on a cold gray afternoon with the wind coming off the water and made myself a promise that I have carried quiet and folded up small in the pocket of my heart for almost 40 years. I promised that if I ever had the means I would do for some other lost child exactly what Opal Merrick had done for me. I never told a living soul about that promise. Some things you keep close because saying them out loud makes them fragile, and there was a long stretch of my life when it was the only thing I owned that was truly worth anything, and I was not about to risk it. I married Emmett Vance when I was 25 years old, and I lost him 7 years ago to the kind of heart attack that does not give a person the courtesy of a goodbye. He was 59 when he went, and so was I, and the silence he left behind in that house was so heavy and so complete that for a while I slept out on the porch, just to be somewhere he had never been, because his absence in our bed was louder than any noise I had ever heard. Emmett came from a family that had owned a piece of lakefront land for 3 generations, a long narrow lot with a collapsing boathouse and a stand of birch trees that turned gold every single October like clockwork. When his parents passed, that land came down to the 2 of us together. We had put both our names on the deed the way Emmett's father told us to, as joint owners with what the lawyer called the right of survivorship, which is a plain way of saying that when one of us died, the whole thing belonged to the other free and clear, with no court and no argument and no one else's signature required. I did not think much about those words at the time. They were just more legal language to me, dry as sawdust. I would come to be very grateful for them, and my children would come to hate them, though they never understood the half of what those words meant. Emmett was a good man, and I do not say that the way widows say it out of habit, polishing up the dead until you would not recognize them. He had a temper he kept on a short leash, and he could sulk for 2 days over a thing that did not deserve 2 minutes, and he never in 34 years of marriage learned to put a dish in the sink instead of beside it. But he was steady, and he was kind in the ways that actually cost a man something, and when I told him early on before we married about the 6 houses and the paper sacks and the $41 in the sock, he did not look at me with pity, which I would not have been able to bear, and he did not look at me like I was something breakable. He just nodded slow the way he did and said that everybody comes from somewhere, and that where I came from only told him I was strong, not that I was damaged. I married him about a month after that. We were poor for most of the years we had together, the kind of poor where you learn which bills can wait and which ones cannot, and we raised our 2 children in the thin margins of that, and I promised myself the whole time that they would never feel the floor drop out from under them, the way I had felt it drop out from under me over and over as a girl. I kept that promise. I kept it too well, maybe. I gave them a childhood so steady and so soft that neither one of them ever had to learn the thing I learned at 18, which is how to stand up entirely on your own 2 feet when there is no one at all behind you. I have wondered this whole hard year whether that was a gift I gave them or a thing I stole from them without meaning to. I want to tell you about them as children, because it matters, and because I need you to understand that I am not describing monsters. Wade was a sweet, anxious little boy, the kind who cried when he stepped on a bug by accident and had to be told it was all right. It happens, come here. He was frightened of the dark, and frightened of thunder, and frightened of the deep end at the town pool. And Emmett used to worry out loud that we were raising him too soft. And I used to tell Emmett to leave the boy alone, that the tender ones grow up into the kindest men if you do not shame the tenderness out of them first. I do not know what happened to that boy. I have spent a great deal of this year trying to trace the exact road from the child who cried over a bug to the man who cracked my ribs on my own flagstones, and I cannot find the turn where it went wrong. There was no single day. It was 1,000 days, each one a little softer than it should have been, a bill I quietly paid, a scrape I quietly smoothed over, a consequence I quietly took away before it could reach him. I loved my son straight into helplessness. That is a hard thing for a mother to write down, but I have promised you the truth in this account, and there it is. Colleen was the opposite of her brother, or she seemed to be. Where he was soft, she was sharp and quick, and wanting always with her eye on the thing the next child had. She was not a bad girl, she was a hungry one, and I did not understand until far too late that a certain kind of hunger does not go away when you feed it, it only learns to expect the feeding. She was beautiful at 7, catching fireflies in a mason jar on the lawn in her nightgown, and I remember thinking watching her that she was going to have an easier time of it in this world than I ever did, that beauty and quickness would open doors for her that stayed locked for a foster child with a paper sack. And they did open. That was the trouble. The doors opened so easily for Colleen that she never learned what it costs to open one yourself with your own 2 hands when it does not want to open. She learned instead that if you smiled the right way and cried at the right moment, someone would open it for you. She learned that from the whole world, and I have had to admit to myself this year she learned it first and best from me. For 7 years after Emmett died, I held on to that land out of loyalty and out of grief, even though it slowly drained me dry. The property taxes came due every single year, whether I had the money that year or not. The boathouse roof let the rain in until the beams inside went soft and black. The brush grew up so thick along the shore that you could not walk down to the water anymore without a machete and a bad attitude. My neighbors gently suggested more than once that I ought to sell it and be done, and every single time I refused because letting it go felt like letting go of the last thing Emmett's hands had ever touched. I paid those taxes with money I earned kneeling on other people's bathroom floors and sitting up through other people's worst nights, and I never once asked either of my children for a dime of help, and they never once thought to offer. I want to be fair about that part, because being fair matters to me even now. I was proud, and I did not ask. But there is a difference between a mother who does not ask and children who never once think to wonder. My son and my daughter drove past the turn to that gravel road 100 times over those 7 years, and not one of them ever wondered how the old woman at the end of it was managing to keep the lights on. I want you to understand how I actually lived in those 7 years, because it is the ground everything else grew out of. I had my sewing, which brought in a little uneven and seasonal more in the fall when the weddings clustered and thin in the dead of winter. And I had the other work, the night work, sitting up with the dying. That is not a thing most people know how to do, and fewer still are willing to, and so it paid when I could get it better than the sewing did. A family would call exhausted and frightened because their mother or their father had come to the last stretch of the road, and somebody had to be awake in the house through the small hours in case the end came, and none of them could bear to be the one, and I would come. I would bring my knitting and a thermos, and I would sit in a hard chair in a dim room, and I would listen to a stranger breathe. I learned the whole vocabulary of it, the rattles and the pauses and the long, terrible, quiet spaces that are not the end yet, but are practicing to be. I held the hands of people I had known for 4 hours while they left the world because their own children were asleep down the hall, too tired or too afraid to sit the last watch. I do not say that to make myself sound noble. I say it because I did that work for years for money to pay the taxes on a piece of land my own children believed was theirs by right, and not one of them ever once sat up a single night with me or asked me what it was like, or seemed to understand that their mother spent her nights doing the hardest thing there is, while they slept in beds they had bought with money they did not have. There is a thing that happens to you when you sit those watches. You stop being able to lie to yourself about what matters. You see over and over what a person reaches for at the very end, and it is never the car, and it is never the kitchen, and it is never the money. It is a hand. It is a name said out loud. It is somebody in the room. I sat with a wealthy man, once a man who had a fine house full of fine things, and at the end there was no one in that house but me, a woman he had hired because he had spent his whole life on the things, and none of it on the people, and he died holding the hand of a stranger, and I have never forgotten it. And it is a great deal of the reason I did what I did with the money before anyone knew I had it. I had watched too many people arrive at the end of the road with full accounts and empty rooms. I was not going to be one of them, and more than that, I was not going to let the money turn me into one of them. Then, this past March, a man in a pressed gray suit knocked on my door and changed everything. He worked for a development company that wanted to build a small cluster of lakeside apartments, and he wanted my land to do it. When he said the number they were prepared to pay $385,000, I had to sit down right there on the porch step because my legs stopped holding me. I had never in my whole life heard a figure like that spoken in my direction. He told me the location was ideal, the water access was rare and getting rarer, and they would pay the full amount without haggling if I could sign the paperwork within a few weeks. He left his business card on my sewing table and drove back down the gravel road, and I stood in my kitchen with my heart going like a rabbit's holding that little rectangle of cardstock like it might bite me. I did not call the number that day or the next. I want you to know that I was not greedy for it. A great many people hearing that a developer had offered a poor old widow $385,000 would have signed the papers before the man's car was out of the driveway. I understood standing in my kitchen that the money would change my life, and I understood too from a lifetime of watching that changing your life is not always the same as bettering it. I had seen money come into families like a flood and wash away everything that had been holding them together. I had seen it turn brothers into strangers and turn a mild man mean. And I had a family such as it was, and I stood there, and I asked myself honestly whether I trusted the people in it to be better than the money, and the answer that came back to me, quiet and certain in my own kitchen, was no. I did not trust them. I did not yet know how right I was to feel that way, but I felt it, and I have learned to respect the things I feel before I can explain them, because they have kept me alive since I was a girl. I did not sleep for 3 nights after that. I walked the property in the dark with a flashlight, remembering Emmett teaching Wade to fish off the rotten dock when the boy was small and still soft and still mine. Remembering Colleen catching fireflies in a mason jar the summer she turned 7 before the world got its hooks into either of them and reeled them somewhere I could not follow. I stood down by the water those nights where you could still get to it if you fought through the brush, and I let myself feel the whole weight of what I was about to do. That land was the last address my marriage had. It was the place Emmett's hands had touched the boathouse. He swore every summer he was going to fix, and never did the dock where he taught our son to bait a hook the birch trees his own father had planted as a young man. To sell it felt those first nights like agreeing that Emmett was really gone, like signing a paper that made his death official all over again years after the funeral. I cried down there by the water more than once, an old woman with a flashlight crying into the dark, and I am not ashamed of it. But somewhere in the 3rd night, I understood something that turned it around for me. I understood that Emmett was not in the land. Emmett was in me in the way I still argued with him in my head, in the recipes I still made his way, in the exact shape of the grief that had not gotten 1 inch smaller in 7 years. The land was just dirt and rotten wood and back taxes. And keeping it was not honoring him. It was only bleeding myself dry to avoid admitting a thing I already knew. He was gone and I was still here. And I had a promise older than my marriage still waiting to be kept, and the dirt could not keep it for me. But I also thought about Opal and the promise, and how for almost 40 years it had been nothing more than a wish, because I had never in all that time had 2 dimes to rub together, let alone the kind of money it would take to actually do something. Here, finally, at 66 years old, was the means. On the 4th night, I dreamed that Emmett was standing at the edge of the water, and he did not say anything to me. He just nodded the way he used to nod when he thought I already knew the right answer, and was only waiting for someone to give me permission to say it. In the morning, I called the number on the card. I sold the land. The paperwork moved faster than I ever expected it to. Inside of 3 weeks, the money was sitting in my account, a number so large it did not look real on the little screen of the bank machine. So large I made the teller print me a slip just so I could hold it in my hand and believe it. And the very first thing I did before I told a single living soul, before I even told Marion Beckett next door, who has been closer to me than a sister for 20 years, was drive an hour into the city to sit down with a lawyer named Nathan Cruz. I want to be careful about how I tell this next part, because it matters far more than it seemed to matter at the time. And if I lay it all out for you now, I will spoil something that is better left folded up until later, the way I left it folded up in real life. So I will only tell you this much. I did not go to see Nathan Cruz because I was frightened of anyone. In March, I was not frightened of a single person on this earth. I went to him because I had spent my whole life watching money change people into strangers, and I did not intend to let it change me, and I did not intend to leave a promise I had carried for almost 40 years to chance or to luck or to the mercy of whoever happened to be standing nearest when I died. I sat in his office for the better part of an afternoon, and I signed a great many documents, and I set up an appointment for a medical examination that he recommended for reasons I did not fully appreciate until much later. I will tell you what all of that was for when the time comes, and not 1 minute before, because that is how it happened to me, and I have earned the right to tell it my way. For now, it is enough to say that by the end of that first week in April, before anyone in my family knew I had $1 to my name, I had already put nearly everything I owned somewhere no one could ever reach it, and I had a plain manila folder tucked in the back of my sewing cabinet that would turn out to be worth more to me than the whole $385,000 ever could have been. I remember the drive into the city that morning better than I remember most days of my life. It was a bright, clear morning in early April, the kind where the light comes in low and gold across the fields and everything looks scrubbed clean, and I drove the whole hour with the radio off just thinking. I was not nervous exactly. I had made up my mind days before out there by the water with my flashlight. But there is a particular feeling that comes over a person when they are about to do the thing they have been waiting almost 40 years to do. And it is not excitement, and it is not fear. It is something quieter and heavier than either something like walking up the aisle at your own wedding, which I have also done. Nathan Cruz turned out to be a careful, unhurried man with a gray office, and a way of listening that made you feel he had all the time in the world for you, which is worth more in a lawyer than cleverness, in my opinion. I sat across the desk from him, and I told him what I wanted to do, all of it, and he did not blink, and he did not try to talk me out of it. And he did not treat me like a foolish old woman who did not understand her own money, which is how a great many men would have treated me, and I have never forgotten that either. He just nodded and got out a legal pad and started asking the right questions. We were in that office the better part of the afternoon. By the time I drove back home into the setting sun, the thing was as good as done, and no living soul knew it but the two of us. For 2 weeks after that, my life looked exactly the same as it always had. Coffee toast, waffle, the light on the water, a hem across my knees. The only difference was a small private smile that would find its way onto my face in the quiet of the afternoons, because I knew what I had done, and no one else in the world knew it. And the not telling was its own kind of pleasure, a warm secret I got to keep entirely to myself. I thought foolishly that I might get to keep the peace of it too. I thought I might just go on being an old woman at the end of a gravel road with a good secret and a sleeping dog, and that would be the whole story. That ended on a Thursday. I was at my sewing table letting out the waist on a church dress for a woman across town when I heard tires crunching on the gravel. I knew the sound of that little white car before I ever saw it come around the bend. Colleen only ever came on Sundays, and not every Sunday at that, so a visit on a Thursday put a cold finger against the back of my neck before she had even parked. My daughter is 37 now. She used to stage houses for a real estate company arranging strangers' furniture so that empty rooms would look like somewhere a person might want to live until the company let her go, and the little business she and her husband started on their own went under inside of a year. She got out of the car in a yellow dress I had never seen before and a pair of heels that sank into my soft spring yard with every step she took, and she came up the walk wearing a smile I recognized from when she was 9 years old and had broken something in the house and was standing there deciding exactly how to tell me about it. "Mama, what a nice surprise to catch you home," she said, and she kissed my cheek, and her lips were cool and quick. "I've been wanting to come out and see you." I made her a glass of ice water, and we sat in the front room, her perched on the edge of the couch, and me settled into the old wooden rocker that had belonged to the foster grandmother in the one home out of 6 where I had been treated with something like kindness, the single piece of furniture I have ever owned that came to me with a story attached. Colleen turned her water glass around and around in her hands, and would not quite look at me straight on, and I felt the visit tip slowly toward its real purpose, the way a boat tips when someone stands up in it without warning. "Mama," she finally said, "I ran into Glenna Dobbs down at the pharmacy the other day, and she told me the strangest thing. She said there were trucks and men in suits out at the lake property surveyors, and I don't know what all. She said you sold it." My heart picked up its pace, but I kept my hands folded still and quiet in my lap, the way I had learned to do at 100 bedsides. Glenna Dobbs could not hold a secret in a bucket with both hands and a lid. Of course she had seen the surveyors, and of course she had told half the county before supper. I was not going to lie to my own child. "I did Colleen," I said. "I sold it a few weeks ago." Something changed behind her eyes then. I have spent a lifetime reading faces, watching a patient's face for pain. They were too proud or too frightened to admit to watching a dying man's face soften when his daughter walked into the room, and I saw the thing that moved behind my own daughter's eyes in that moment, and it was not concern for me. It was arithmetic. It was the quick, hungry calculation of a person doing sums in her head. "Oh, Mama, that's wonderful," she said, and she leaned forward and the water glass went still in her hands. "That's really wonderful. And what did you get for it?" It had to be a good amount, all that lake frontage. That's rare these days. She did not ask whether it had been hard for me to sell her father's land. She did not ask whether I had cried when I signed the papers, which I had right there at the closing table with the pen shaking in my hand. She asked the number. She went straight for the number the way a fox goes straight for the henhouse door. I felt something go cold and quiet in me, then watching her. It was not the asking that did it exactly. People ask about money. It is a rude habit, but a common one, and I could have forgiven a clumsy question. It was the way her whole face had rearranged itself the moment I said the word sold, the way the visit itself had suddenly made sense, snapped into focus like a picture coming clear. She had not come because it was spring and she missed her mother. She had come because Glenna Dobbs had run her mouth at the pharmacy and my daughter had done the sums and gotten in her car. Every soft word she had said to me since she walked in the door, "Catch you home wanting to come see you," kissed my cheek, all of it had been the wrapping on this one hard question, and I had let myself unwrap it slowly because a foolish hoping part of me had wanted the wrapping to be the gift. It was not. The question was the gift, and the question was how much. "It was a fair price," I said. "I'd rather not get into the particulars if it's all the same to you." "Mama, you can tell me. I'm your daughter." She reached over and put her hand on my knee, and her voice went soft and confiding and warm, and every single word of it landed on me like a salesperson's pitch and not a daughter's love, because I had heard enough real love in my life to know the difference. "I worry about you out here all by yourself with a sum like that just sitting in a bank account. It isn't safe, honestly it isn't. I just want to make sure you're being smart about it, that's all. Here's the thing. Todd and we've been going through a rough patch." She caught herself because Todd was not the name, and she smiled and corrected it. But the point is, she was so deep in her own rehearsed speech that the wrong words were coming out. "Trent and the business didn't take off the way we planned, and we've had some expenses we didn't see coming, and I thought, well, maybe this is one of those times when family can lean on each other a little." And there it was. She had not driven an hour on a workday in her good yellow dress because she missed her mother. She had come because she had found out there was money. Lean on each other, how Colleen. Just a little help. Not charity, Mama, I would never ask you for charity. A loan. 25, maybe 30,000, just enough to get us steady again, and we would pay it back with interest the minute the business turns the corner. I promise you that. I swear it. I sat with it for a long moment, looking at my grown daughter's face, and I tried very hard to keep my voice level and even. $25,000 or $30,000. She said it the way a person asks to borrow a cup of sugar over the back fence, as though it were nothing at all, as though it did not represent years of my knees and my back and my sleepless nights, sitting up with the dying. "Colleen," I said, "that money is not for lending. I have plans for it." The softness went out of her face all at once, the way a light goes out when you flip the switch, and what replaced it was an expression I knew from her childhood, the pinched, wronged look of a girl who has just been told no and cannot believe the word could possibly apply to her. "What plans, Mama? What plans could you possibly have? What are you going to do with that kind of money at your age? You're not going to buy yourself a mansion or take a world cruise. It would make so much more sense to put it into something that actually grows, something that helps the whole family, instead of just sitting there in a bank doing nothing." "At my age," I repeated, and I felt those 3 words go into me like a sewing needle sliding under a fingernail. "Because I am 66 years old, I have no right to my own money." "That is not what I said." "It is exactly what you said." I set my sewing down in my lap. "And I want to ask you something now, since we are being so honest with each other. When I was scrubbing other people's floors at 60 years old, because I could not make the tax payment on that land, where was the whole family then when I was sitting up all night in a stranger's house watching a stranger die, so that I could pay my own light bill, who in this family stopped to ask whether I had enough to eat?" Her face went red. We didn't know you were struggling. You never said anything to anybody. If you had asked us, we would have helped you. You did not know, I said quietly, because you did not look. She flinched at that, and for just a second, half a second, I saw the real Colleen surface behind her eyes. The girl who used to fall asleep against my shoulder in church. And I thought, if she says one true thing right now, one honest thing, I will meet her halfway. I will find some way through this. I waited. I actually held my breath. But the moment passed and the surface closed back over her like water closing over a stone. And when she spoke again, it was not to me, her mother. It was to the obstacle standing between her and the money. She had no answer ready for that, so she changed direction, which is a thing my daughter has done her whole life the moment she feels herself starting to lose. She admitted a little at a time, the way you draw out a splinter that has gone in deep where the money had actually gone. A new car they could not afford and had bought anyway. A kitchen they had gutted and remodeled to impress people who did not care about them and never had. Some investment of Trent's that had looked like a sure thing and had simply evaporated into the air one afternoon and taken their savings with it. They had spent themselves into a deep hole chasing a life that looked good from the outside and felt like drowning from the inside. And now they wanted me to fill that hole back in with the money I had earned by selling the one thing my husband left me. So you spent recklessly, I said, and now you would like me to pay for it. That is not fair, she snapped, and her patience was gone. Now I could hear it in the flat, hard edge that came into her voice. You're being resentful. You can't punish us forever for things that happened years ago. I am not punishing anyone, Colleen. I am protecting something that is mine. That money came from Daddy's land. That land was our inheritance too. And there it was, the word I would come to hear over and over again in the weeks ahead, thrown at me like it was a settled fact instead of a wish. Inheritance. I felt something old and hard settle into its proper place in my chest, like a bone going back into a socket. Your inheritance, I said. That property sat abandoned for 7 years while I bled myself white keeping it alive. You never paid a tax bill on it. You never patched the roof. You never pulled a single weed down by that water. And now that I have turned it into something with my own decision and my own signature, all of a sudden it belongs to you. Inheritance is inheritance, Mama. It doesn't matter who paid the taxes. She was wrong about that, more wrong than she knew, and there was a legal reason she was wrong that would matter enormously before this was all over. But I did not tell her so. I was saving that the way I was saving a great many things. That was when I heard the second engine come up the gravel. Through the front window, I watched a mud-spattered pickup truck pull in beside her little white car, and my stomach dropped straight through the floor, because there is no such thing as a coincidence. When your 2 children arrive one right after the other on a Thursday afternoon. Colleen had arranged this. She had brought reinforcements and timed them to roll in only after she had softened me up first, and the plain fact that my own daughter had planned out a visit to her mother, like a general, planning a campaign, told me more about exactly where the 2 of us stood than anything she had said out loud. Wade came in without knocking the way he has done since he was a teenager, as though the house were still his to walk into whenever he pleased. He is 40 now, my oldest, a big man gone soft through the middle with a patchy beard and the flushed, loose-eyed look of somebody who had already been drinking though it was barely 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He does construction work when he can get it, framing and roofing, mostly without a license, and mostly for cash under the table, and he owes money at every bar and every card game in the county. He dropped himself down onto the couch beside his sister, and the whole thing groaned under him, and I caught the smell of the beer on his breath from clear across the room. I looked at my son sitting there on my couch, 40 years old, drunk in the middle of a Thursday afternoon, and I felt 2 things at once that did not fit together and never have since. I felt afraid of him, physically afraid in a way I had never once been afraid of my own child in 40 years, because he was a big man and he had been drinking and there was something loose and unpredictable in his eyes that I did not recognize. And underneath the fear at the very same time, I felt the old, helpless tenderness, the thing that does not switch off no matter what, the memory of his small, hot hand in mine, crossing a parking lot, the weight of him asleep against my side in a thunderstorm. A mother's love and a mother's fear can live in the same body at the same moment, pointed at the same person, and I do not know a harder thing to carry than the 2 of them together. I carried them both sitting in Opal's rocker watching my son's chest rise and fall with beer breath, and I understood that the afternoon was going to get worse before it got better. "Hey, Mama," he said with a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Colleen told me the good news." "Of course she did," I said. said, and I lowered myself back into the rocker because my legs had begun to shake, not with fear yet, but with a kind of furious grief that was worse than fear. Look, Wade said, spreading his big hands open in front of him, like a man being reasonable, like a man who only wanted what was fair. We're family. We should all sit down and talk about how to handle this the smart way, all of us together. There is nothing to handle, Wade. The money is mine, and I will decide what happens to it. Mama, be reasonable, Colleen said. We're not asking for everything. Wade's got his own troubles too. He's behind on things. I looked at my son, this 40-year-old man who had never in his life held a single job past the 6-month mark. What troubles Wade? He shifted his weight and the couch groaned again. Some back payments, a few debts, nothing you need the details of. The point is, family helps family. That's how it's supposed to work. Family helps family, I said, slow and quiet, and I let the words hang there in the air between the three of us. That is an interesting thing to say to me now after 7 years in which I barely existed to either one of you. When was the last time one of you drove all the way out here without needing something from me? When did either of you pick up a telephone just to ask how your mother was doing? They looked at each other. It was the same look they had traded as children when something was broken, and they were silently deciding between them which lie they were going to tell me. But they were grown people now, and grown people's lies have consequences, and that look frightened me in a way it never once had when they were small enough to fit in my lap. I could feel the whole afternoon tilting towards something I did not want to happen. I stood up out of the rocker because I could not make myself sit still under it any longer. I spent 7 years out here alone, I said, and my voice was climbing now, and I could not seem to catch hold of it and bring it back down. 7 years while the two of you spent money you did not have on cars and kitchens and things to impress people, and now that there is finally something in my bank account here, you both are on a Thursday afternoon with your hands held out and the word inheritance in your mouths. Get out. Mama Wade started, and he began to rise up off the couch. Get out of my house, both of you, and do not come back until you can remember how to speak to me like I am your mother and not a bank. They went, but they did not go the way I expected them to go. They did not slam out of the house in a fury, shouting and stomping the way they would have when they were younger. They stood up slowly and they smoothed down their clothes, and that they traded one more of those looks between them, cool and slow and unhurried, and it put a chill down the length of my spine that was far worse than any shouting could have been. At the door, Wade turned back to me, and his face had gone to something I had never once seen on it in 40 years. A flat and calculating stillness, the look of a man who has stopped being angry because he has decided anger is no longer useful to him. This isn't finished, Mama, he said low and even. You're going to think about it. We're not just going to stand around and watch you sit on top of money that ought to be all of ours. It is not all of yours, I said, and I tried hard to sound braver than I felt standing there in my own front room. Colleen gave a small, sad little laugh from the doorway, the kind of laugh you give a person you have privately decided is not quite well anymore. You should really think about going and seeing somebody, Mama, she said gently, so gently. Making a big decision like this all by yourself at your age. It isn't like you. Maybe the money's just too much for you to handle on your own. Maybe you need a little help managing it. Maybe somebody else ought to be the one making these kinds of decisions for you now. And then they were gone, and I heard both engines start up out in the yard, and I sat back down in Opal's rocker, and I shook for a long time, and it was not from cold. Waffle came and put his head in my lap the way he does when he can tell something is wrong, and I sat there stroking his ears in the dark and trying to talk myself out of what I had just seen. That is the thing about your own children, you see. Your whole body is built to give them the benefit of the doubt. 40 years of loving a person does not just evaporate because they say a cruel thing in your front room. My mind kept offering me softer explanations the way a mind will. They are just desperate. People say ugly things when they are desperate. Colleen did not mean the part about the doctor. She was only frightened about the house. Wade was drunk, he will call and apologize tomorrow. I sat there in the dark manufacturing excuses for them one after another because the alternative, the true thing, was so much heavier than I wanted to pick up. And I might have gone on making excuses for weeks. That is the honest truth. I might have talked myself all the way back around to believing it was nothing. A bad afternoon, a family quarrel. Except that the house was wrong, and I could feel it, and I have never in my life been able to unfeel a thing once I have felt it. It was only after their taillights had disappeared down the gravel road and into the trees that I began to notice the house itself was wrong. Small things, the kind of things you feel before you can put a name to them. The manila folder of papers I keep in the cabinet by my sewing table was not squared up against the corner, the way I always square it every single time out of 40 years of habit. The little china dish by the front door where I dropped my spare key held one key sitting in it instead of two. And when I finally picked up my phone to call Marion with my hands still trembling, I found a voicemail I had not heard come in left an hour earlier from Colleen's number. She had called me by accident the way people sometimes do when a phone shifts around in a purse and presses itself against something, and it had recorded 11 seconds of the inside of her car before it cut itself off. In those 11 seconds, I heard my daughter's voice muffled and unaware and low, and then I heard Trent's voice clear as a struck bell saying, "And you're sure the doctor you talked to will put it in writing, that she's not competent to manage it, because that's the whole thing, honey. That's what makes the whole plan work." I sat there in the gathering dark with the phone in my hand, and I understood all at once and all the way down to the floor of me that this had not been a desperate visit from a pair of struggling children. This was a plan. It had a shape to it and a strategy behind it, and it reached out beyond that room and beyond that afternoon, and it was aimed directly at me, and it had been aimed at me long before either one of them ever knocked on my door. My daughter wanted my money. That was bad enough, and it broke something in me. But my son-in-law wanted something worse than money. He wanted a piece of paper that said I had lost my mind so that a court of law would hand him the keys to everything I owned, and my own 2 children were going to help him do it. I played those 11 seconds over 4 times, 5 times 6, standing in my dark kitchen, because I could not make myself believe it the first time or the second. The doctor. In writing. Not competent. That's what makes the whole plan work. There was no soft explanation for those words. I tried to find one the way I had been finding one for everything all evening, and there was not one to find. You do not talk about getting a doctor to declare your mother incompetent because you are worried about her. You do that because you have decided she is a problem to be solved, an obstacle standing between you and something you want, and the most efficient way to get around an obstacle that can talk is to make sure no one will listen to it anymore. That was what my son-in-law had decided I was. Not a person. A lock on a door. And a lock is not something you reason with. It is something you pick or break or get a locksmith for. I understood standing there that I had stopped being Trent Holloway's mother-in-law somewhere along the way and become in his mind a technical problem. And that a man who thinks of you as a technical problem will do things to you that a man who thinks of you as a person never could. What none of them knew sitting out there in their cars planning how to strip a helpless old woman of her fortune was that the fortune was already gone. Already moved somewhere, they could never follow it, and the helpless old woman had signed the papers that would one day undo the whole scheme, 3 full weeks before any of it ever began. I did not sleep that Thursday night. I sat up in Opal's rocker with Waffle's warm chin resting on my foot and the porch light burning yellow through the window, and every time the house settled on its old bones or a branch scraped across the roof. I was up on my feet with my heart lodged in my throat. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and did something I had never once done in 20 years of living alone at the end of that road. I went around the whole house and checked every single window latch, testing each one with my thumb, and then I pushed a kitchen chair up under the knob of the back door, and I sat back down and waited for a dawn that felt like it might never come. A woman should not have to barricade herself inside her own home against her own children. That is a sentence I never in my life imagined I would have cause to write. And I want you to know that it is the truest and the heaviest sentence in this whole account. I thought a great deal that night about the word Colleen had used, the way she had said maybe somebody else ought to be making these kinds of decisions for you now. It kept coming back to me in the dark, because here's the thing about that word maybe and the whole soft worried voice she had put around it. It was not a threat, not out loud. If you wrote it down on paper and showed it to a stranger, it would look like nothing at all, like a daughter fretting over her aging mother. That was the genius of it, and I do not use that word lightly about my own child because I do not think the cleverness was hers. That was Trent's shape on it, Trent's careful hand. Every single thing they said to me could be defended later as concern. We were worried about her. She's out there all alone. She's making strange decisions. She isn't herself. And a person who has genuinely lost her mind cannot argue her way out of that box because the more she insists that she is fine, the more she sounds exactly like a woman who is not. I lay there in Opal's rocker listening to my own house tick and settle around me, and I understood that they had built me a trap with no floor in it, a trap where the harder I fought, the deeper I fell, and that the only way out of a trap like that is to have built your evidence before you ever step into it. Which, without knowing why I did not sleep. But somewhere in those long hours, I stopped being only afraid and started being something colder and more useful than afraid. The next morning, Colleen called and her voice had changed completely overnight, from the top of it to the bottom. Gone was the pinched, wronged tone from the day before. In its place was something warm and worried and gentle, as though the ugliness in my front room had simply never happened at all, as though I had dreamed the whole thing. And that frightened me far more than the anger ever had. When Colleen is angry with me, I always know exactly what I am dealing with, because her anger is honest at least. This new version of her, sweet and managing and smooth, was a daughter I did not know how to fight because I could not find the edges of her. "Mama, I hope you managed to sleep all right last night," she said. "I've been thinking about our talk all night long and I feel just terrible about the way it went. We both said things we didn't mean. Why don't we start all over, just you and me, somewhere nice? Let me take you out to lunch. The Sparrow, that little place downtown you like so much. No pressure, no arguing, I promise. Just a mother and her daughter having lunch." I should have said no. Every hard-won instinct I had was telling me to say no. But there is a part of a mother that never fully gives up hoping, even when the hoping is foolish, and even when she knows better, and that part of me answered the phone before the rest of me could clap a hand over its mouth. I told her yes. But I also told her plainly before she could get off the phone that my decision about the money was final and was not going to change over a plate of lunch, and she said, "Of course, Mama." Of course, she only wanted to smooth things over between us. We settled on the following Tuesday at noon. The Sparrow is a busy little cafe with good home cooking and a great many eyes and ears, and I told myself driving home the whole thing over in my mind that a public room was a safe room, that nothing bad could happen to me at a table by a window with the lunch crowd all around. I dressed with care that Tuesday morning. I put on the soft rose-colored dress that Emmett had given me for my 50th birthday, the one that still fit if I did not breathe too deep, and I did my hair the way I like it best because I wanted to walk into that cafe looking like a woman who knew her own mind and not the confused old creature Colleen had described standing in my own doorway. I arrived a full 15 minutes early and took a table by the window where I could see the door. Colleen arrived exactly on time to the minute, and she did not come alone. Trent came in right behind her. Trent Holloway is 42 years old, thin as a rail with a thread of a mustache and shirts that always look about a size too expensive for the man wearing them. From the very first day my daughter brought him home to meet us, I have had the feeling that something about him was rehearsed, that every warm thing he ever said to me was a line he had practiced in front of a mirror until it came out sounding natural. He has a smile that stops at his cheekbones and never once reaches his eyes, and a way of talking to a person that makes them feel less like company and more like a signature he is patiently trying to collect. Emmett never trusted him. I should have paid more attention to that. Emmett was not a suspicious man by nature. He gave everyone a fair shake and then some, but the first time Colleen brought Trent out to the house years ago now, Emmett shook his hand and made small talk and grilled the hamburgers, and after they had driven off, he stood at the kitchen sink drying a plate for a long time longer than the plate needed, and he said that fella watches your hands when you talk, not your face. I did not know what he meant at the time. I know now. A man who watches your hands is calculating what you might do, what you might sign, what you might reach for. A man who watches your face is trying to know you. Trent Holloway has watched my hands from the day I met him, and it took me until I was 66 years old and sitting in a cafe booth to understand that my dead husband had read the man correctly in a single afternoon over a plate of hamburgers, and that I had spent years being polite to a person Emmett had known instantly to keep an eye on. "Maribel," he said, and he kissed my cheek, and the cold of it went right through me and settled somewhere behind my ribs. "It's so good to see you. I hope you don't mind me tagging along today. Colleen thought it might help to have somebody at the table who understands the financial side of things." "I do mind, actually," I said. This was meant to be between my daughter and me. "Mama," Colleen said, quickly leaning in, "Trent is family, and he knows so much about money and planning more than either of us ever will. I just thought he might be able to help us find something that works for everybody." "There is nothing to find," I said. Trent leaned in toward me across the table with the patient, faintly amused expression of a man who believes with his whole heart that he is the smartest person sitting at any table he happens to sit down at. "Angela," he said, and then caught himself because that was not my name either, and I understood in that small slip that he had run this same play on other old women before me, that I was not the first and would not have been the last. "Maribel, forgive me. Let me just explain how these things usually work in a family that has real resources to work with. When there's a meaningful amount of money in play, the intelligent move, the move any good advisor would tell you, is to structure it so that it benefits every member of the family at once. Spread strategically, that kind of money does far more good than it ever does, just sitting idle in one person's account, losing value to inflation every single day. Trent, with respect, my money is not your concern. But it is, though, Maribel. That's the thing. I'm your daughter's husband. What touches Colleen touches me, and what touches the two of us touches your grandchildren, Junie and Cole. He said the two names, slowly laying them down on the table between us one at a time, and I understood exactly what he was doing, reaching past everything else for the two people in this whole world I would do anything on earth for, and holding them up in front of me, like a card he had been keeping up his sleeve for exactly this moment. My grandchildren are cared for, I said. If they need something, their mother is welcome to come to me and talk to me about that one specific thing. But I am not handing over a fortune so that the two of you can go on living a life you cannot afford to live. His face tightened, and he changed his approach, the way a man changes his grip on a tool that is not doing the job. Let me be honest with you then, since we're all being so honest today, because I don't think you're seeing how serious this really is. We could lose the house. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Maribel, your grandchildren could lose the roof over their heads. Is that something you want on your conscience at your age? Colleen put her hand up over her mouth and produced a single tear right on cue, the exact same way she used to do it in high school when she wanted the car keys. It's true, Mama, she said, and her voice trembled just so. Junie asked me last week why she can't do her dance class anymore, and I didn't know what to tell her. I just stood there in the kitchen, and I didn't have an answer for my own little girl. And here is the thing that I have turned over in my mind 100 times since that afternoon, the thing that still catches in my throat. I believe that tear was real. Not the reason for it, which was a performance she had rehearsed, but the water itself. I think my daughter had cried enough real tears in that kitchen over the wreck she and Trent had made of their lives, that she had learned to call on them the way an actress calls on a memory, and that the line between what she truly felt and what she was pretending to feel had gotten so worn and so thin that even she could not have told you sitting there which side of it she was on. That is what frightened me most watching her. Not that she was lying to me. My daughter had lied to me plenty over the years. Small lies, the ordinary lies of a person who is ashamed. What frightened me was that she no longer seemed to know she was doing it. She had told herself the story so many times that I owed them, that it was only a loan that a mother is supposed to give, that she had come to believe her own performance was simply the truth. And a person who believes her own performance is the most dangerous kind of person to sit across a table from, because you cannot appeal to the part of her that knows better. That part has gone quiet. That part is asleep. The sheer performance of it turned my stomach over. And then Trent made his one real mistake of the afternoon. He got tired of coaxing me, and he let me see the edge of the thing he had been keeping hidden. I'll tell you something else you might want to think about, he said, and he dropped his voice down low so the table next to us would not catch it. A woman your age living all alone out at the end of a road like that with a large amount of money that half the town already knows about. That's a dangerous situation, Maribel, I mean that. There are men out there who look for exactly that kind of situation. It would be a terrible thing, just a terrible thing, if something were to happen to you out there all by yourself, with no one around to hear. I looked at my son-in-law across a plate of food I had not touched, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost like cold water poured down my back that I was being threatened by the father of my grandchildren in a corner booth of the Sparrow Cafe over the lunch special. I set my napkin down on the table and I stood up. I am not going to order anything, I said. And I am not going to give either one of you a single dollar, no matter how you dress up the asking. Threats included. We are not threatening you, Colleen said loud enough that 2 tables turned their heads to look. We just want you to be reasonable, Mama, that's all. Being reasonable to the 2 of you means giving you my money, I said. I am done being reasonable in that particular way. I barely held me up, and as the door swung shut behind me, I heard Trent say to my daughter, low and flat and perfectly calm, "Don't worry, honey. There are other ways to handle this." I sat in my car in the cafe parking lot for a long time before I trusted myself to drive. My hands would not stop shaking on the wheel. I kept thinking about the specific way he had said it, the calm of it, the way you would say, "Do not worry about the weather, we will just take umbrellas." There are other ways to handle this. A person handles a problem. He had already in his own mind moved past asking me. Asking me was the thing they had just tried at the cafe over lunch, and it had failed, and he had crossed it off the list with no more feeling than a man crossing an item off a grocery list and moved down to the next line. And I did not know what was written on the next line. That was the thing that had my hands shaking. I did not know how far down that list went or what was at the bottom of it, and I understood for the first time sitting in that parking lot that I might be in real danger, the kind you do not come back from, and that the danger was wearing the face of the man who had married my daughter and fathered my grandchildren. I finally got the car started, and I drove home slow, checking my mirror the whole way, an old woman in a rose-colored dress checking her mirror on a county road in the middle of the afternoon. Those 5 words followed me all the way home. There are other ways to handle this. I drove the gravel road with my hands shaking on the wheel, and that night I did the one thing I should have done a full week earlier. I called the single person left on this earth that I trust without any reservation at all, Marion Beckett, who has lived in the house next to mine for 20 years and been a widow even longer than I have. I told her all of it. Start to finish the sale of the land, the demands, the tears. Trent's threat in the booth. Marion listened to the whole thing without once interrupting me, which is not her habit, and never has been, and when I was finally finished, she was quiet for a long moment on the line. "Maribel," she said at last, "those are not children throwing a tantrum anymore. You hear me? That man just sat across a table and as good as told you he'd have you robbed. Maybe worse. You cannot sit out there all alone at the end of that road waiting around to find out what he meant by it. You need to protect yourself, and I mean starting tonight, not after something happens to you." She was right, of course. And here is the thing I need you to understand about me, because every single person who heard this story after the fact seemed to assume that I spent those weeks cowering under my bed with the lights off. I did not. I have been taking care of myself since I was 18 years old with $41 folded in a sock, and I was not about to quit doing it at 66 because a thin man in an expensive shirt frightened me over lunch. That threat in the cafe did not make me smaller. It woke something up inside me that had been sleeping for a long time. The very next morning, I got to work. I called a locksmith and had him come out and change every lock in the house, front and back, and I did not hand a single one of the new keys to either of my children. I bought a doorbell camera and a second little weatherproof camera for the back door, and Marion's grandson came over and mounted them both for me and showed me patiently 3 times over how to watch the feed on my phone. I bought a small voice recorder, the kind that fits into the pocket of an apron, and from that day forward, I kept careful notes dated and detailed of every call and every visit, because a lifetime of watching over the sick had taught me that a careful written record made in the moment is worth more than the very best memory made after the fact. I called Nathan Cruz, the lawyer, and I told him everything that had happened, and he listened, and then he told me to come in and see him. And he told me one more thing that changed the way I understood the whole affair. He told me to call the county's office for the protection of vulnerable adults and make a formal report so that if anything ever did happen to me, there would already be a file with my name on it and a paper trail leading straight back to the people who had threatened me. I did that too the same afternoon, sitting at my own kitchen table with the voice recorder running. I want to describe what those days were actually like, because I think people imagine that a person in my situation is consumed by fear every waking minute, and it was not like that. It was stranger than that. Most of each day was completely ordinary. I made my coffee. I fed Waffle. I sat at my table and I sewed because I had orders to fill, and people were depending on me, and the work steadied my hands and my mind both. And then the phone would ring, or a car would slow at the end of the road, or I would catch a shape in the doorbell camera, and the ordinary would drop away, and the fear would come up cold and fast, and then it would pass, and I would go back to my hem. I lived in 2 worlds at once that spring. In one of them, I was a 66-year-old seamstress with a dog and a garden. In the other, I was building a case methodically the way I had once methodically watched a body decline, noting the times and the changes, keeping my records dated and clean. I found, to my own surprise, that I was good at the second thing. All those years of sitting quiet watches, of noticing what other people missed, of writing down exactly what I observed without letting my feelings smear the ink turned out to be a kind of training. I had been preparing for this my whole life without knowing it. Every dying stranger I ever sat with had taught me how to stay clear-headed in a dark room while something terrible happened slowly. I was in a dark room again, but this time the thing happening slowly was happening to me, and I was not going to be a quiet witness to my own undoing. I was going to be the one holding the pen. And then Cruz reminded me of the appointment I had made back in the first week of April, the medical examination. I had not fully understood the purpose of when he first recommended it. I had gone to see a specialist, a geriatric physician named Dr. Ruth Halverson, and she had evaluated me thoroughly and carefully over the better part of a morning, testing my memory and my judgment and my capacity to manage my own affairs. That week, the written report came back to me, signed and formal and official, stating in plain medical language that Maribel Vance was of entirely sound mind and fully competent to handle her own money and her own life and her own decisions. I had ordered that evaluation in the first week of April, for reasons I could not have named out loud at the time. Nothing but a feeling, a lifetime's hard instinct that money makes people say you are not yourself anymore. Now, standing in my own kitchen with that signed report in my hand, I understood that I had built myself a shield 3 full weeks before I knew there was ever going to be a spear. I have thought a great deal since then about that instinct, about where it came from, because it saved me, and a person ought to understand what saves them. I think it came from the watches again, from all those nights sitting with the dying and their families. I had seen more times than I could count the way money brings out the worst in people at the exact moment they should be at their best. I had watched grown children argue over a dying parent's jewelry in the next room while the parent was still breathing. I had watched a man's sons fight over his house across his own hospital bed. I had seen over and over that the promise of an inheritance can turn love inside out and show you the ugly lining of it, and that it happens fastest and worst to the people who tell themselves they are above it. So when the money came to me, some deep part of me that had been watching all those years knew, without being able to say why, that I needed to make myself impossible to take from before anyone found out I had it. I did not know it would be Trent. I did not know it would be my own children. I only knew, the way you know a storm is coming from the smell of the air, that money changes people, and that I had better nail everything down before the wind picked up. And I did. I nailed it all down in the calm before, and when the storm finally came, it had nothing to tear loose. I want to stop here now and tell you plainly what I had already done with the money, because it is the hinge that the whole rest of this story turns upon. And because keeping it from you any longer would be a cheat, and I promised myself I would not cheat you. When I drove into this city that first week of April and sat in Nathan Cruz's office for a whole afternoon, I was not simply sitting there making out a will. I had come to keep the promise I made at Opal Merrick's graveside almost 40 years before. With Cruz's help, I took the great majority of the money, the bulk of that $385,000, and I placed it into a charitable trust that can never be undone. Not paused, not reversed, not reached by any court or any relative or any clever lawyer for as long as it exists. It was already, by the time Colleen ever heard the word from Glenna Dobbs at the pharmacy counter, no longer mine to give away and no longer anyone's to take. It belonged to a purpose now. And with a smaller, separate portion I had opened protected education savings accounts, the special kind meant for a child's schooling that cannot be rated or reassigned, one for Junie and one for Cole, so that whatever became of their foolish parents, my 2 grandchildren would always have a paid way forward into their own lives. The account that still had my own name on it, the one Colleen and Trent and Wade were all circling like a pack of dogs around a scrap, held only what a careful woman keeps back for her own old age, enough to live on, and no more. There was no fortune sitting there to be seized. There never had been, not for a single day that they spent plotting to seize it. I did every bit of that before anyone alive knew I had a dime, not to hide it from creditors, because I did not owe a single soul on this earth so much as a penny, and a woman who owes nothing to anyone may do exactly as she pleases with what is hers. I did it because I had watched money turn people into strangers. My whole life, long since I was a small child, being passed from one house to the next, and I did not intend to leave my promise or my grandchildren at the mercy of anyone's greed. When I finally understood all of it, standing there in my kitchen with the doctor's report in one hand and the trust papers waiting in their folder beside me, I very nearly laughed, and I very nearly wept, both at the same time. They were building an elaborate and expensive machine, my own children and the man my daughter married, to take away something that was already gone. The break-in came the following week. I was over at Marion's house for supper, the 2 of us at her kitchen table with a pot of chicken and dumplings between us, when my phone buzzed against the wood. And there on the little screen was a man at my own back door, working the handle, and then the door swinging open because he had a key, the spare key that had gone missing from the china dish by my door on the very day that Wade and Colleen came out together. He was inside my house for 11 minutes. The camera caught every second of it. He went straight for my sewing cabinet and then straight for my bedroom, straight for the places where a person keeps their papers and their valuables. And he left again with nothing at all in his hands, because there was nothing left in that house to find. When I finally got home and walked slowly through my own rooms, I felt violated in a way I cannot fully put into words, my dresser drawers pulled out and disturbed, my papers shuffled and left crooked, the metal box from under my bed dragged out into the middle of the floor, and pried open and left empty of anything worth the trouble of taking. But underneath the fear there was something steadier, something almost like a grim and quiet satisfaction, because I had every bit of it on film with a clear picture of his face, and because I had built myself a house with nothing left inside it worth stealing. I walked through every room slowly that night, taking stock, and it was a strange kind of grief, different from any I had felt before. It was not grief for a thing they had taken because they had taken nothing. It was grief for the last of my safety. 20 years I had lived at the end of that road with the doors unlocked half the time, and I had felt safe there, safer than I had ever felt anywhere in my life, because it was mine, and no one could put me out of it. And now a stranger had walked through my rooms with a key my own children had stolen off my table, and had opened the box from under my bed, the box where I keep Emmett's watch and the children's baby teeth, and the few small things that a life leaves behind, and had pawed through all of it looking for money, and had left it scattered on my floor. They did not steal anything of value, but they stole the feeling of the place, the thing that had made it home, and not just a house, and that they could not give back, and did not know they had taken. I stood in my own bedroom that night, and I understood that I would never again feel the particular ease I had felt in that house for 20 years, and that whatever happened next, whether I won or lost that specific thing, was already gone, and I mourned it quietly on my knees, picking Emmett's watch up off the floor. 2 days after that, my husband's cousin came out to see me, and what he told me on my own porch turned the whole picture in the light and showed me a shape I had not seen until then. Roy Sutton is a mechanic, a quiet, decent man in his middle 50s, Emmett's first cousin on his mother's side, and he is not one to gossip or exaggerate or carry tales for the pleasure of it. He stood on my porch, turning his ball cap around and around in his big grease-stained hands, and he would not quite meet my eye. "Cousin Maribel," he said, "I've been chewing on whether to come out here and tell you this for 2 days now, and I finally decided I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. I was down at Sully's the other night just having the one beer after work, and Wade was there and he was drunk. Real drunk, running his mouth to a couple of fellas I did not like the look of one bit, and they were making plans about you." My stomach went cold and dropped. "What kind of plans, Roy?" "Ways to make you sign the money over to them. And your son-in-law's name came up more than once, more than twice." Roy turned the cap another half circle. "Maribel, and this is the part I really came to tell you, it wasn't Wade running the show down there. From the way those fellas talked, Wade is just the muscle in this thing. This whole business, the pressure they're putting on you, the men, all of it, it's Trent pulling the strings because Trent is the one who's in real trouble. Those fellas at the bar, they weren't Wade's drinking buddies. They were there about a debt, Trent's debt. Word going around is he's into a hard man for $260,000, the kind of loan you do not walk away from, the kind that comes looking for you, and he's all out of time, and he's decided your money is how he gets himself out from under it." There it was at last, the true shape of the thing. This had never really been about my children resenting me, or about an inheritance, or even about greed in the ordinary small human way. It was about Trent Holloway drowning in a debt to a dangerous man and reaching out in a panic for the nearest thing that might save his own skin and finding it in his wife's mother. The strangers who had been seen lurking near my property were not local troublemakers that Wade had scared up at a bar. They belonged to that debt. And my son-in-law had looked at the whole slow ruin of his own life, and he had decided that the way out was to take a helpless old woman's fortune, and if she would not simply hand it over to him, why then to have her declared out of her mind so that a court of law would hand it over for her. I thanked Roy for coming, and I meant it, because I know exactly what it cost a quiet, decent man to drive out to his cousin's widow's house and tell her that her family was plotting against her. He did not want to be the one. Nobody ever wants to be the one. And he stood there turning his cap and being the one anyway, because he could not live with himself otherwise. And that is a rarer kind of courage than people give it credit for, the courage of an ordinary man doing an uncomfortable right thing when looking away would have been so much easier. After he drove off, I sat on my porch for a long while as the light went out of the sky, and I let the new shape of it settle over me. Because it was worse than I had thought, and it was also in a strange way clearer. Up until Roy came, I had been fighting my children, And there is no lonelier fight in the world than that one no ground to stand on, because how do you defend yourself against the people you made? But now I understood that I was not really fighting my children at all. I was fighting Trent. My children were weapons he had picked up and was using against me, my drunk, desperate son and my hungry, frightened daughter, and that did not excuse them. Nothing excused them, but it changed the shape of the thing. There was a hand behind the hand, and a hand can be caught. Roy told me one thing more before he left, the worst thing, the thing that turned my fear straight to ice. One of them said Trent knows a doctor who'll write up whatever they need. A paper saying you've got dementia, that you can't manage your own affairs anymore. They figure if they've got that paper in hand, they can get some judge to put Trent in charge of your money. I took all of it to Nathan Cruz the very next day, and I will tell you what he told me, because it matters a great deal, and because the men plotting against me out there in the dark were either too ignorant or too desperate to know it. He told me that their whole scheme from top to bottom was built on a fantasy. You do not simply buy yourself a false diagnosis and walk into a courthouse and walk back out with control over a grown woman's entire estate. It does not work that way, and it was never designed to work that way. To have a person declared incompetent to be made her legal guardian or the conservator of her money, a person has to file a formal petition in court, and then the court orders its own independent medical examination performed by physicians. The court itself chooses not physicians you bring in off the street. And the woman herself is notified of all of it, and she has the right to her own lawyer. And there is a hearing, a real hearing, where she can appear in person and object and be heard by the judge. It is slow and it is public and it is very, very hard to fake, and it was designed precisely and deliberately to protect people exactly like me from people exactly like them. And here was the thing that made Nathan Cruz smile a thin, satisfied lawyer's smile at the sight of a battle already won before it was fought. I already held in my own 2 hands a signed report from a well-respected physician stating plainly that I was completely competent dated weeks before any petition they could possibly dream up. If they walked into any courtroom in this entire state and claimed that Maribel Vance had lost her mind, I would walk in right behind them with a doctor's letter and a folder full of dated recordings and camera footage, and they would not merely fail. They would be exposed for exactly what they were. I held on to that knowledge like a railing on a dark set of stairs, and it steadied me. But I want to be honest, because a legal certainty does not chase away a physical fear. A piece of paper in a folder does not stop 2 men with prison records from circling your house at dusk. I had won the argument that would happen in a courtroom if it ever got that far. But the ugly, violent part of their plan had not yet been played, and some animal part of me, the part that had learned to listen to a house at 3 a.m, knew it was still coming. Nathan Cruz said something to me that day that I have thought about many times since. He said, "Maribel, you have done everything right. You have done more than almost anyone I have ever seen do. And I want you to hear me say that I still cannot promise you that nothing bad will happen, because the law is very good at what comes after, and not so good at what comes before." He said the law can punish a man who hurts you, and it can protect your money, and it can put the whole story in front of a judge, but it cannot stand in your yard tonight. He was not trying to frighten me. He was being honest, which is worth more than comfort, and I already knew it was true. The paper in my folder would win the war. But wars are won after the battles, and I still had a battle to get through alone at the end of a gravel road, and no folder was going to fight it for me. So I did the only thing left to do. I kept my phone charged and near me. I kept the recorder in my apron. I kept Marion and Roy on call, and I waited the way I had waited through 100 long nights in other people's houses for the thing I knew was coming to finally come. In the quiet hours of those days, I thought a great deal about Junie and Cole, my grandbabies, and about the fact that their own father was holding them up like bargaining chips, and about how if this thing went the way violent things sometimes go, those 2 small children might lose their father to a prison cell, or worse. I told myself over and over that I had already made their futures safe, that whatever happened to the grown fools around them, their schooling was locked away where no one could touch it. But there is no trust in the world, and no lawyer either, that can put a shield around a child's heart to protect it from one day learning exactly who its father truly was. The confrontation that the smart plan could not accomplish came for me at last, the ugly way, on the first Saturday in May. I was driving home from the pharmacy that afternoon, a small white bag of nerve medicine sitting on the passenger seat beside me when I turned off the county road and onto my own gravel and saw Wade's pickup truck already parked in my yard. And parked right behind it, a gray sedan I did not recognize with 2 men sitting inside it, who were plainly and simply waiting for something. I knew the very instant I laid eyes on them that these were the men from Sully's, the men who belonged to Trent's debt. I did not pull in. I stopped the car short of the driveway back where the trees still hid me, and I got out quietly and slipped in behind the big maple that stands at the corner of my property, the one Emmett planted the year we married. And I took out my phone with my hands shaking so hard I could barely work it, and I called Marion, and then I dialed the emergency line, and then I started the little recorder in my pocket. All of it, every bit of it, because I had learned by then to gather up everything to let nothing happen to me that did not also happen to a camera or a microphone or a witness on the other end of a telephone line. Wade was calling my name across the yard. "Mama, I know you're around here somewhere. Come on out now. We're just going to talk, that's all." But his voice did not belong to a man who wanted to talk. One of the men got out of the gray sedan, tall with tattooed forearms and a flat, mean face, and then the second one climbed out two shorter and heavier through the shoulders with a scar that ran from his ear all the way down to the corner of his mouth, and the sight of the two of them walking around my yard like they already owned the ground under their feet turned my legs to water beneath me. Then Colleen's little white car came flying up the gravel in a spray of dust, and she got out of it furious in heels again, in another dress I had never seen, and she did not so much as look at her brother. She just marched toward my dark windows and called out, "Mama, stop this! Stop acting like a child and come out here and talk to us like an adult." I stood behind that maple tree and I watched the four of them move around my house, my son checking the bushes along the foundation, my daughter cupping her hands and peering in through my windows, the two strangers circling slow and easy and sizing up the doors like men who did this kind of thing for a living. It is a strange thing to watch people hunt for you around your own home. I had planted flowers along that foundation with my own hands. I had washed those windows Colleen was peering through every spring for 20 years. And now my own daughter was pressing her face to the glass looking for her mother, the way you look for a rabbit gone to ground. And two strange men were testing my door handles, and my son was crashing through my flower beds, and I was hiding behind a tree Emmett had planted on our wedding anniversary, watching it all, holding my breath, an old woman pressed against the bark with her heart slamming so hard she was sure they would hear it across the yard. I have never felt more alone than I did in those minutes, and I have felt alone in some deep places in my life. But I want to tell you what got me through it because it matters. It was not courage exactly. It was the watches. All those nights sitting still in dark rooms while something terrible happened slowly had taught my body how to do this, how to stay quiet and clear and present when every nerve was screaming to run. I had a lifetime of practice at being still in the dark while I was afraid. It turned out to be the most useful thing I ever learned, and I learned it sitting with the dying, and now it was keeping me alive. I heard the scarred man ask if I might be inside, and I heard Colleen tell him no. She changed the locks on us, we don't have keys anymore. And I heard the tall tattooed one say that it did not matter one bit. He could open any door in that house in 5 minutes flat. And I heard Wade say, no, we can't break in, that's a crime. And I heard the scarred man answer him cold and bored that they did not have all day to stand around a yard. And then, thank God in his heaven, I heard sirens. The two men heard them too, and they did not stand around to explain themselves to anybody. They ran for the sedan and threw up a rooster tail of gravel, getting themselves off my land, tearing past the corner just as the patrol car turned in, and they were gone down the road before it had fully stopped, leaving Wade and Colleen standing there in my yard, trying to arrange their faces into something like innocence. 2 officers got out of the car, one young and one older, with gray coming in at his temples, and the look of a man who had seen just about every possible way a family can come apart at the seams. And I stepped out from behind my tree because I would not stand there and let my own children lie to the law on my own property, and because I understood at last that the safest place in the whole world for me right then was standing out in the daylight next to 2 officers of the peace. Officers, I called out, walking toward them across the grass. "I'm the one that called. My name is Maribel Vance. I own this house, this whole property. And these are my children, but they came out here with 2 men who ran off the second they heard you coming, and I hid myself because I am afraid of them." "Mama, that is a lie," Colleen cried out. "We came out here to visit you. That's all this is." The gray-haired officer looked slowly back and forth between us, and he asked in the even, unhurried voice of a man who has learned to want nothing but the plain truth about the 2 men in the gray car. Wade said flatly, looking the man dead in the eye, that there had been no men, that he did not have the first idea what anybody was talking about. And I told the officers what I could prove, that I had it on camera. All of it that my cousin had heard the whole plan laid out at Sully's Tavern, that I had already made a report with the county weeks ago. And I watched the color drain right out of my son's face as he understood finally and completely that I was not the confused, defenseless old woman his whole plan required me to be that I never had been. That was the moment when Wade lost the last of himself. All the frustration and the debt and the drink and the fury of a man watching his scheme collapse into dust right in front of his eyes came boiling up out of him all at once, and he came at me with his fists clenched white at his sides, shouting that I was going to give them that money right now, today, this minute. When the young officer stepped in between us, Wade threw him off to the side like a man swatting away a branch that was in his way, and he lunged the rest of the distance to me. He hit me with the full weight of his shoulder, all 200 and some pounds of him, and I went down backward onto the flagstones I had laid myself years ago with my own hands one at a time, kneeling in the dirt on a summer afternoon while Emmett brought me lemonade. I put my hand out to catch myself the way a body does, and I felt my wrist give way beneath me with a sound I heard more than I felt a dry green snap like a stick underfoot, and then the flagstone came up hard into my side, and something deep in my chest cracked, and a pain like a red-hot iron drove every last bit of the breath straight out of me. I heard myself cry out from very far away, as though it were some other woman making that sound. I heard Colleen scream her brother's name high and horrified, as though she were only now far too late seeing with her own eyes the thing she had helped to build. I heard the two officers wrestling Wade down to the ground, and his voice thick and ugly and slurred, still yelling even as they did it that I was a crazy old woman stealing his money right up until the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. And I lay there on my own cold flagstones with my broken wrist bent wrong beneath me and my ribs on fire with every shallow breath, and I looked straight up at the wide blue April sky going on to May, and through all of that pain I felt one clear and terrible thing. And it was not fear, and it was not even anger. It was grief. Pure grief. Because the boy I had rocked to sleep in this very yard, the boy who had caught fish off that rotten dock with his father's hand steadying his, was being folded into the back of a police car for breaking his own mother's bones. And no fortune on this earth not kept and not given away could ever put that one thing right. I did not hate him lying there. I want you to understand that because it would be easier to tell you that I hated him and simpler to hear. But it is not true. I lay on my flagstones with my wrist broken and my ribs on fire, and I watched them put my son in the car, and what I felt was not hate. It was the purest and most terrible love I have ever felt in my life. Love with nowhere left to go. Love for a person who no longer exists, except inside your memory love that has outlived its object and does not know it yet and keeps reaching anyway. I loved the boy in the thunderstorm. I loved the boy with the fishing pole. And that boy was gone, had been gone for years, and the man they were putting in the car had killed him, as surely as if he had done it with his hands, and there is no word for grieving a person who is still alive and standing in your own driveway in handcuffs. English does not have that word. Maybe no language does. But it is the truest thing I felt in that whole terrible year, lying on the ground, I had built watching my boy taken away loving a child who was already dead inside the body of the man who broke me. The ambulance came in under 10 minutes, and the paramedic who knelt down over me on my own flagstones had gentle hands and a calm, low voice, and he told me what I already knew from a whole lifetime of tending broken bodies in the dark. My wrist was fractured. At least one rib on my left side was cracked, maybe 2 of them. They lifted me carefully onto a stretcher, and as they carried me past the patrol car, I saw my son through the window glass, and for one long moment our eyes met and held. The fury had all gone out of his face. What was left in its place was the look of a boy who has done a thing he cannot ever take back, and is only in that very moment beginning to understand it. "Mama," he called out through the glass, and his voice cracked in the middle of it. I didn't mean for this. I just wanted. But whatever it was he wanted, I did not hear the end of it, and lying there on that stretcher, I was not sure it would have mattered to me if I had. I have finished that sentence for him 1,000 times since lying awake. I just wanted the money. I just wanted to get out from under it. I just wanted things to be easy. I just wanted my father back maybe, or my childhood, or the version of himself he might have been if I had loved him a little harder and a little wiser. I do not know how he would have finished it. And I have come to believe he did not know either that the sentence had no true end that I just wanted was the whole of it, a man reaching for something he could not name, the way he had reached for a bottle in a card game and easy money his whole life, always reaching, never once able to say for what. That is the saddest thing I know about my son. Not that he was cruel, because I do not fully believe he was cruel, not at the root of him. But that he was empty in a place where something should have been, and he spent his whole life trying to fill it with things that would not fill it. And when the reaching finally turned violent, it was pointed of all the people in the world at the one who had loved him longest and asked the least. I just wanted. I have stopped trying to finish it. Some sentences do not have ends. Some men do not either. At the hospital, they set my wrist and put it in a hard cast, and they told me the ribs would simply have to heal on their own, that there is nothing to be done for a cracked rib but time and rest, and the kind of deep patient pain that reminds you it is there every single time you draw a breath or laugh or try to turn over in bed at night. The doctor who saw me was young and kind, and he told me the cast would be on for about 6 weeks, and the ribs would take somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks to knit themselves back together, and that for a good while I would not be lifting anything or doing anything that pulled at my side. No sewing for a good long while, he said gently when I told him what my trade was, and that was its own small sharp grief laid right on top of all the others, my hands stilled and idle on top of everything else that had been taken from me. Marion came flying into the emergency room so fast she was out of breath from the parking lot, and she sat with me the whole long night through, and when I told her quietly that it had been my own son who did this to me, she took my one good hand in both of hers, and she did not say a single word, because there was nothing to say that would have helped. And Marion has always understood better than anyone I ever knew the difference between comfort and noise. There is a particular loneliness to a hospital in the middle of the night, and I knew it well from the other side of it, but I had never known it from the bed. The sounds are different when you are the one lying down. The cartwheels in the hall, the low voices at the station, the beep of a machine 2 rooms over counting out someone else's heart. I lay there and listened to all of it the way I used to listen to a house at 3 in the morning, except now the house was a hospital, and the body I was listening to for signs of trouble was my own. And I thought with my ribs aching every time I breathed that I had spent my whole life on the wrong side of this room, out of pride. Always the one keeping watch, never the one being watched over, always the one who needed nothing, and that it had taken my own son breaking my bones to finally put me in the bed, and that maybe there was something in that I was supposed to learn, and had been too stubborn to learn any gentler way. The body has a way of teaching you what the mind refuses to hear. Mine was teaching me one cracked rib at a time that I was not made of iron, that I never had been, and that pretending to be had cost me more over the years than any weakness ever could have. That first night in the hospital I did not sleep, and it was not the pain in my wrist and my side that kept me awake, though the pain was considerable and constant. It was the plain arithmetic of my own life laid out on the ceiling above the bed for me to look at. I had raised 2 children. I had rocked them both to sleep in the same yard where one of them had just put me on the ground. I had gone without over and over again in the years when Emmett and I had almost nothing, so that the 2 of them would never have to, and I had never once let either of them see me cry over an unpaid bill. And somewhere in the long middle stretch of their lives, somewhere between the fireflies in a mason jar and the handcuffs in my own driveway, the 2 children I had loved with my whole heart had become people I no longer recognized and could no longer trust to be alone in a room with me. I lay there in that hospital bed, and I grieved them as though they had died, because in a way that I had never understood until that night they had. A mother is not supposed to outlive her children. No one ever tells you that she can lose them without a funeral, that they can be standing right there in front of her, breathing and grown and whole, and be gone from her all the same. I thought about Wade as a small boy that night, because the mind does that to you. It hands you the tenderest thing at the very worst moment, like a cruelty dressed up as a mercy. I thought about how he used to be frightened of thunderstorms, and how he would come padding into our room in the middle of the night, dragging his blanket behind him, and how Emmett would lift him up into the bed between us without ever fully waking, and how the boy would fall back asleep in about 30 seconds flat once he was there safe in the middle, breathing slow. I thought about the exact weight of him. I could still feel it. That was the terrible thing. I could still feel the exact weight of my son's small sleeping body against my side. And it was the same side, the left side, where his shoulder had cracked my ribs on the flagstones that afternoon. The same boy. The same side of the same woman. I did not know how both of those things could be true at once, and the world could just go on turning like nothing had happened, but it could, and it did. And the machines beeped, and the night went on, and toward the end of it I stopped trying to make sense of it and just let it be true. Both of it, all of it. the small warm boy and the grown man in the handcuffs, because they were the same person, and I had loved him every single day in between, and none of that was going to help either one of us now. Toward morning, a nurse came in to check on me. A woman about my own age with tired, kind eyes and a soft way of moving. And she saw that I was lying there awake, and she did not ask me any bright, cheerful, foolish questions. She just reached over and adjusted my pillow and then sat down in the chair beside my bed and stayed with me for a minute in the dark. I have sat in that very chair 1,000 times myself, on the other side of it, watching over somebody else through the worst night of their life. It is a strange and humbling thing to be the one lying in the bed. It taught me something I had somehow managed to go 66 whole years without ever once learning, which is that letting another person care for you is not a weakness, and that I had spent my entire life so fiercely determined to need no one at all that I had, without ever meaning to made myself very easy to abandon. I decided lying there in the thin gray light with that kind stranger beside me, that I was finished with that. Not finished with being strong, because being strong is the only way I know how to be, but finished at long last with being alone on purpose. The gray-haired officer came by the hospital before they discharged me to take my full statement, and I gave him all of it, every last piece, from the sale of the land back in March to the demands to Trent's threat at the Sparrow, to the men at Sully's, to the break-in caught on my own camera, to the whole cold scheme to have me declared out of my own mind. He wrote all of it down, page after page, and when I finally finished, he looked at me for a long, quiet moment, and he told me that what my son had done to me had a name in the law, elder abuse, and that it was a felony, a serious crime, and he asked me whether I wanted to press charges. I will not pretend to you that it was an easy question to answer. It is one thing to be furious with your own child. It is another thing entirely to put your name down on the piece of paper that sends him to prison. But I thought about the flagstones and the 2 men in the gray car, and the piece of paper Trent had wanted so badly, the one that would have erased not just my money, but my very right to decide anything at all for myself ever again, and I understood that I had no honest choice left to me. Yes, I told him, I want to press charges, not only for the wrist and the ribs, but for all of it, the threats, the men, the break in the whole cold machine they built together to take an old woman apart, piece by piece. I lay awake a long time over that decision before I gave the officer his answer, because I want you to know it did not come easy, and I did not give it lightly. There is a voice in a mother that will forgive her child anything that will find the excuse that will say he was drunk. He was desperate. He did not mean it. He is still your boy. I heard that voice all night long. It is a powerful voice, and it is not entirely wrong, and I did not silence it, because silencing it would have meant killing a part of myself I did not want to kill. But I set it beside another voice, a colder and older one, the voice of the girl in the parking lot, with the duffel bag, who learned that no one was coming to save her. And that girl asked me a simple question. She asked if this man were not your son, if he were a stranger who had threatened you, and had you robbed and thrown you to the ground and broken your bones, would you hesitate for 1 second to press charges? And the answer was no. I would not hesitate at all. And then she asked the harder question, the one that decided it. She asked, so does being your son mean he gets to do to you what a stranger could not? Does the love you have for him make you fair game in a way you would never be for anyone else? And when I put it that way, lying in the dark, I understood that protecting him from the consequences of what he had done was not love. It was the same thing I had been doing his whole life, the quiet paying of his bills, the smoothing away of his consequences. And it was the very thing that had helped make him into a man who could break his mother's bones and expect to be forgiven. Loving him had never once required me to let him destroy me. It had only felt that way because I had never learned the difference. I learned it that night. Yes, I told the officer in the morning. Press the charges. All of them. I want to be truthful with you about the weeks and the months that followed, because the way these things actually resolve themselves in real life is slower and messier and far less satisfying than anyone ever wants it to be. Nothing was settled in a day or a week. Wade was arrested and charged, but there were arraignments and postponements and court-appointed lawyers and hearing dates that got moved and moved again, and the whole thing stretched itself out across the entire late spring and on into the summer. I stayed at Marion's house while my ribs slowly healed because I could not yet face going back to my own home, could not yet stand on those flagstones without the whole afternoon rising up in front of me. And every week seemed to bring some new piece of the story up into the light. The 2 men from the gray sedan were picked up within the month, and it turned out that both of them had records as long as your arm fraud and extortion, and one of them, to save his own skin from the worst of it, told the investigators plainly that Trent Holloway had hired their employer's help to lean on me, and that the whole debt underneath all of it belonged to Trent. That one confession cracked the entire case wide open, and what had started out as a single man's assault on his mother became almost overnight an investigation into a conspiracy. I want to say a word here about what those weeks were actually like in the day-to-day of them, because the way I have laid it out for you makes it sound like one thing led cleanly to the next, and it did not. Real trouble does not move in a straight line. It moves in a slow, sideways drift, with long, empty stretches where nothing happens at all, and you almost let yourself believe it is over, and then a phone call comes and knocks you flat again. There were days that spring when I sat in Marion's garden and felt something close to fine, and then a detective would call to ask me to walk him through the Sparrow lunch one more time, and I would have to say all of it out loud again. Trent's exact words, the way he dropped his voice, and by the time I hung up the phone, my hands would be shaking all over again as though it had happened that morning. Healing and reliving were braided together the whole time, and you could not pull them apart. My body was knitting itself back together while my mind kept picking at the same 3 or 4 minutes over and over the flagstones. The sound my wrist made my daughters scream. Marion never once told me to stop talking about it. She understood the way she understands most things without being told that a person has to say a thing enough times before it stops being a live wire in their hand and becomes finally just a story that happened to them, something with edges you can hold. It was right in the middle of all of that, while I was still propped up on Marion's couch with a pillow held against my ribs, that my daughter turned. Colleen came to the door one evening in early summer, looking like an entirely different woman than the one in the heels who had peered through my dark windows. She had lost weight she did not have to lose, and there were deep hollows carved out under her eyes, and she wore old plain clothes, and she stood on Marion's porch and asked quietly if she could come inside. Marion looked over at me ready in an instant to send her away, but I nodded because I wanted to hear whatever she had come to say. She sat down on the very edge of a chair, the way you sit in a house where you are no longer sure you are welcome, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. I looked at my daughter across Marion's small living room, and I saw underneath the weight she had lost, and the plain clothes and the hollow eyes, the 7-year-old with the mason jar, and the 9-year-old deciding how to confess a broken thing, and the bride in white, and the whole of her, all the Colleens she had ever been stacked up inside the woman sitting there, and I felt my chest ache with it, because that is the curse of a mother you never get to see, just the person in front of you. You see all of them at once, every age they ever were, and you love all of them at once, even when the one in front of you has helped a man try to destroy you. She could not look at me at first. She looked at her own hands, at the floor, at the window, anywhere but at my face, and I let her, because I have sat across from enough frightened people to know that you cannot rush a person toward a hard truth. You can only hold the space still and quiet until they find their own way to it. "Mama," Colleen said, and she could barely get the words out. "I found out what he was really doing, Trent. I swear to you, I thought, God help me, I thought we were just going to talk you into it. I told myself the whole time that it was only a loan that you owed us that much, that it wasn't really so wrong. But that's not what it was it? It was never that." She was shaking all over. "The guardianship, the doctor. That was never about protecting anybody, was it? It was about him getting his hands on the control of your money so he could pay off what he owes. And when it all started falling apart, when the police got involved, I found out what the plan was if the whole thing went bad. He was going to put it on me, Mama. All of it. The papers, the petition, the forms, the things he had me sign without reading. My name is on every single one of them. Not his. His name isn't on anything. He set it all up so that if anybody was ever going to go to prison for trying to take your money, it was going to be me, and he was going to walk away from it clean and keep the children while I did the time. I sat with that for a good while, turning it over. It was, I thought, the truest thing about Trent Holloway I had ever heard in my life, that he had built the entire scheme from the ground up so that his own wife would take the fall for it if it failed, and that my daughter had not seen it, had not let herself see it until the day it was finally aimed at her own heart. It was a betrayal folded up inside a betrayal. And I will tell you the thing I understood in that moment that I did not say out loud to her because she was not ready to hear it, and it was not the time. I understood that Trent had done to Colleen exactly what Colleen had done to me. He had looked at the person who loved him and trusted him, and he had seen not a person, but a resource, a thing to be used and then discarded when she had served her purpose. He had made my daughter into an instrument the same way my daughter had tried to make me into a bank. The cruelty ran in a straight line from him to her to me, each one turning the person who loved them into an object. And the only difference, the only one, was that when it was finally done to Colleen, when she was finally the one being used and thrown away, it woke her up. It did not wake her up when she was doing it to me. It only woke her up when it was done to her. That is not a flattering thing to understand about your own child, but I have promised you the truth. And the truth is that my daughter did not come back to me because she suddenly saw how she had wronged me. She came back to me because someone wronged her the same way, and it hurt. And the hurt taught her what her own cruelty had felt like from the other side. People do not usually change because they understand. They change because they get hurt in the exact spot where they hurt someone else, and it finally teaches them the thing that understanding never could. So now you come to me, I said. Now I know what he is, she said. And I would rather lose every single thing I have than let him use me against you and then take my babies too. I'm going to the investigators, Mama. I'm going to tell them everything I know, all of it about Trent and about those men and about the doctor. I don't care what it costs me anymore. I can't be the person he was turning me into. I won't. Before she left that night, she stood in Marion's doorway with her coat half on, and she said one more thing, the thing I believe she had truly come to say and had been too afraid to lead with. Mama, I keep going back over that afternoon at your house, the Thursday, and I remember you asking me when was the last time I ever called you just to see how you were doing. And I couldn't answer you standing right there because there wasn't a last time. There was never a time. Not once. Her voice broke apart. I turned you into a bank in my own head so that I wouldn't have to feel bad about never calling, because a bank doesn't have any feelings you have to worry about, and a mother does. I made you into a thing so that I could keep on taking from you and not feel it. I don't know how a person is ever supposed to forgive that. I'm not even asking you to. I just needed to say out loud that I finally see it. I did not embrace my daughter that night. I was not ready to, and she did not ask me to be. But I will admit to you that when she said that something in my chest that had been clenched up tight and hard since that Thursday afternoon in March loosened by just a fraction, not into forgiveness, not yet, but into the bare possibility that forgiveness might one day have somewhere to land. She had told me the truest thing anyone in my family had said to me in a year, and she had gained absolutely nothing by saying it. And that, more than any tears ever could have, was how I knew that my real daughter was somewhere still alive inside the stranger who had worn her face all spring. She told me the truth, and she went home to her children, and that for the moment was enough. The resolutions came over the rest of that year one at a time in the slow, grinding, patient way of the courts. Wade, faced with the camera footage and the officer's own eyes and testimony, pleaded guilty. He was sentenced in the summer to 2 years with the possibility of parole after 1 if he completed a treatment program for his drinking and his gambling, because the judge, to his credit, could see with his own eyes that a sick man and a cruel man are not always the very same man, even when they happen to share the one body. I sat in the courtroom the day they sentenced my son. Nobody made me go. Marion offered to keep me home, said there was no reason to put myself through it, and she was right that there was no reason. And I went anyway because he was my child, and I had been present for the first breath he ever took, and it did not seem right to be absent for this. Whatever this was, a kind of death, a kind of birth, I did not have a name for it. He looked terrible. He had lost weight in the county jail, waiting for the date, and his hands shook. And when they brought him in, he found my face in the gallery right away, the way a child finds his mother's face in a crowd, some instinct that never fully dies. And he held my eyes for a moment, and then looked down ashamed and could not look up again. When the judge read the sentence, he did not react, but I saw his shoulders drop just slightly, and I understood that some part of him was relieved that the sentence was almost a mercy to him, a set of walls and a schedule and a program, a structure to hold a man who had proven he could not hold himself. I did not go to him afterward. They took him out a side door, and that was all. But I sat in that emptying courtroom for a while after everyone had gone, and I let myself cry finally for the boy in the thunderstorm one last time, because it seemed like the right place to bury him in a courtroom on the day they took away the man he had become. The 2 men from the gray sedan received far longer terms on account of their records, and the man behind the debt. The hard man who had sent them drew the heaviest sentence of all when the whole conspiracy was finally laid out in the daylight. Trent Holloway was charged, and his debt came due with no fortune anywhere to pay it, and the dangerous man he owed had run all the way out of patience with him. And Trent learned, I have to imagine out there somewhere in the wreckage of his own making, that there are worse fates in this world than being told no by your mother-in-law. Colleen, because she had come forward on her own and cooperated fully and testified, was not sent to prison. She was given probation and ordered into therapy, which she had already begun on her own before the judge ever said the word, and made to perform a year of community service, which the judge, in a stroke of something that looked to me a great deal like wisdom, directed her to serve at a care facility for the elderly. And I filed for and received an order of protection so that whatever came next, whatever any of them decided to do, the law itself would stand in the space between me and the men who had done this to me. Through all of it, from the first day to the last, Trent never once came to face me himself. It was always Colleen who did the coming again and again in the quiet, patient, humble way of a person trying to earn back something she knows in her heart she may never fully earn. Now I will tell you the thing I have been keeping from everyone, the secret at the very center of all of it, the truth that was already true and already finished on the very first day my daughter heard that I had come into money. One evening late in the summer, when my ribs had finally stopped stabbing me with every breath and I was well enough to sit out in Marion's garden with a tall glass of iced tea sweating in my hand, she asked me the one question that not a single other person had thought to ask me in all these long months. Not how much did you get for the land, not what are you going to do with it now, but simply gently with real tenderness in her voice. Maribel, honey, what did you want that money for in the first place? Because I have known you for 20 years. And I know for a fact you weren't hoarding it out of meanness or spite. That's not in you. What was it really for? And so I told her about Opal Merrick. I told her about the seamstress 2 blocks down from the group home who took in a scared 18-year-old girl with a duffel bag and $41 and no place on earth to sleep, and gave her a broom and then a needle and then a trade, and then without ever once saying the word out loud, a whole entire life. I told her about the promise I made at Opal's graveside almost 40 years ago. Now that if I ever in my life had the means, I would do for some other lost child exactly what Opal had done for me. Marion listened to all of it without interrupting, the way she does with the light going gold and long across her garden and the ice melting slow in our glasses. And when I got to the part about the promise, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about ever since. She said, Maribel, do you know that in 20 years of being your neighbor and your friend, in 20 years of coffee on your porch and suppers at my table, you never once told me any of this? And she was right. I never had. I had carried Opal and the promise and the whole shape of where I came from, folded up small and private in the pocket of my heart for 40 years, and I had let even my closest friend in the world believe I was simply a widow who sewed a woman with an ordinary past because I had learned so young to keep the tender things hidden that I had gone on hiding them long after there was any danger left to hide them from. And I understood, sitting in her garden, that this too was a thing the money and the trouble had cracked open in me. It had forced the private thing out into the light at last, and the light did not destroy it the way I had always feared it would. The light only let someone else finally see it and be moved by it, and love me a little more for it. I had been wrong my whole life about that. Saying the tender thing out loud does not always make it fragile. Sometimes it makes it real. And then I told Marion what the money had already become weeks before anyone ever came asking for a piece of it. In Nathan Crew's office that first week of April, I had established a charitable trust, one that can never be undone or reversed or reached by any hand, and I had named it the Opal Merrick Foundation. Its whole purpose, its only purpose, is to help young people who are aging out of foster care the very way that I once did. Children who turn 18 years old and are handed their few belongings in a sack and shown the door with nothing and no one waiting for them on the other side of it. The foundation gives them what Opal gave to me: training in a trade. Help finding that first place to live. A steady hand reaching across the terrible gap where a family is supposed to be and simply is not. And with a separate, smaller portion set apart from all the rest, I had opened those protected education savings accounts for Junie and for Cole, so that whatever became of their parents, whatever happened to the 2 grown fools who made them my grandchildren's schooling, was safe and paid and could never be touched by anyone. I did that part first, if you want to know the truth of it, before I even set up the trust before anything else. The very first thing I did with that money, the very first, was make sure those 2 children would be able to go to school, no matter what the adults in their lives did to each other. Because I had been a child once who was at the mercy of the adults around her, passed from house to house on the whims of grown people who were supposed to know better and mostly did not. And I knew in my bones what it is to be small and to have your whole future hang on the choices of people you cannot control. I was not going to let Junie and Cole hang like that. Whatever their parents became, whatever they did, however far down they dragged themselves, Those 2 children were going to have a floor under them, a solid paid floor that no bad decision of Trent's and no desperation of Colleen's could ever pull out from under their feet. That was not generosity. Do not mistake it for generosity. It was the oldest and fiercest thing. I know an old woman making sure the children were safe before she did one single other thing, and I would do it again tomorrow, and I would do it first again before anything every time. Marion had tears running freely down her face by the time I finished talking. Maribel, she said, your own children tried to steal money that was already going to save children just exactly like the child you used to be. And those accounts, they were all circling like buzzards. There was never one single thing in them worth stealing because you had already taken care of everybody. Even them. Even the grandbabies they were holding up like a bargaining chip. That is the part that breaks my heart the very most, I said. If Colleen had ever once come to me kindly, if she had ever asked me a single question about my own life instead of about my bank account, she would have found out that her own 2 children were already provided for, already safe, that I had seen to it before she even knew I had $1. Trent held Junie and Cole up in front of me like cards to play against me, and they were safe the whole entire time, safer than that man could have made them in 100 lifetimes of trying. The greed almost destroyed the very thing it pretended the whole time to be fighting for. I went ahead with all of it more determined than I had ever been in my life, because if those long, hard months had taught me any one thing, it was the difference. The plain and permanent difference between people who genuinely need help and people who simply want what is yours. The Opal Merrick Foundation held its opening that November, about 8 months after I sold the land in the community room of the public library downtown. Marion stood right beside me the whole time, and so did neighbors who had known me for years, and Roy Sutton stood at the back of the room turning his cap around in his hands and looking prouder than I had any right in the world to make him look. I had not wanted to make a speech. I am not a woman who makes speeches. I have spent my life with my mouth full of pins and my eyes on my work, and the thought of standing up in front of a room full of people and saying words out loud made my stomach turn. But they asked me to, and Marion told me I owed it to Opal to say her name out loud in a room full of people at least once, and she was right. So I stood up, and I held on to the little podium with my good hand, and I said the only true thing I knew how to say. I said that 40 years ago a woman who owed me nothing looked at a frightened girl in a doorway and decided the girl was worth teaching, and that everything I had ever become had grown out of that one decision, that one open door, that one broom handed to a stranger. I said that I had spent 40 years believing I could never repay it, because Opal was gone and you cannot repay the dead. And then I said that I had finally understood the thing I had gotten wrong all those years, which is that you do not repay a gift like that. You cannot. You can only pass it on, hand it forward to the next frightened person in the next doorway, and that the passing on is the only repayment there ever was or ever could be. And then I could not say any more because my throat closed up, and I sat down, and the room was quiet, and then it was not quiet, and Roy Sutton was crying openly at the back, and not bothering to hide it. And I thought, Opal, wherever you are, I finally said your name out loud in a room full of people, and I am sorry it took me 40 years. Colleen came too. She stayed back near the door and did not once try to approach me during the ceremony itself, and only afterward, when the room had mostly cleared out and the folding chairs were being stacked, did she finally come near. Mama, she said, I just wanted to tell you that I'm proud of what you're doing here. It's a good thing. It's a really good thing. And then quietly looking down at her own hands. Do you think we could ever have a normal relationship again someday? I looked at my daughter for a long moment before I answered her, because she deserved the truth from me, and not a comfort. I don't think we can ever have the relationship we had before Colleen. That one was built on a kind of trust that got broken, and you cannot unbreak a thing like that just by wishing hard enough that it was whole again. But maybe with a great deal of time and a great deal of proof, we can build something new between us. Something honest from the ground up. That is the most I can promise you, and I want you to know that it is a great deal more than I could have promised you 6 months ago. That's more than I have any right at all to ask for, she said, and she was crying, and this time I did not think for 1 second that she was performing, because there was nothing left in the world for her to get from me by doing it, and she wept anyway standing there in the emptying room. The very first young person the foundation ever helped was a girl named Destiny Boyd, 18 years old, who had aged out of the system that spring with a garbage bag full of clothes and nowhere on earth to go, exactly the way I once had all those years ago. We placed her with a good program, and we got her enrolled in a course to learn a trade, and we helped her find a room of her own with a door that locked. The first time I ever met her, she stood in my doorway, pretending with everything she had that she was not frightened half to death, and I knew that face. I have worn that face. I wore it in Opal Merrick's doorway 40 years ago, and I thought standing there looking at her, there you are, Opal, still doing your good work all these long years later through a pair of hands you never lived to see. Destiny comes by on Sundays now. I am teaching her to sew a little at a time when my wrist allows for it. She is quick and proud and terrified and brave all at once, and she is going to be all right in this world, and I did not do that alone. Opal started it 40 years ago in a little shop that is not even there anymore. I only kept the promise. The first Sunday she came, she would not sit down. She stood by my sewing table with her arms crossed and her chin up, ready for me to want something from her, because everyone in her whole life so far had wanted something from her, and she was only 18, and already she knew that much for certain. I did not ask her a single question about where she came from. I just put a needle in her hand and a scrap of muslin in front of her and showed her how to make one straight line of stitches, and I let her get it wrong and wrong again, and I did not correct her the way you correct a child. I corrected her the way Opal corrected me, which is to say I showed her my own hands doing it and let her watch and figure out the difference for herself. About an hour in, without either of us saying anything about it, she uncrossed her arms and sat down. That was all. She sat down. But I had to get up and go into the kitchen for a minute so that she would not see what it did to me. A girl I had known for 1 hour, deciding in her own time that she could put her guard down in my house. I stood at my kitchen sink with the water running so she would not hear me, and I thought about a scared girl in a doorway 40 years ago, and the old woman who had let her sweep the floor without asking her one single question, and I understood that this is how it works. This is the only way it has ever worked. You cannot save anybody. You can only leave the door open and put a broom in their hand and wait and let them decide for themselves that they are safe enough to stay. Opal knew that. It took me until I was 67 years old and standing at my own sink to learn it. A few weeks after the opening, a letter came in the mail from Wade, the first word I had gotten from him since the day he broke my bones. He wrote that he thinks about what he did to me every single day, and that he hates himself for it every single day, and that in the program finally he was beginning to understand just how sick he had let himself become over the years. He wrote that he was not asking me to forgive him, because he knew that forgiveness of that kind takes a long time if it ever comes at all, and that he only wanted me to know that he was sorry, truly sorry, and that when he got out, he meant to spend the rest of his life trying to become a man his mother would not be ashamed of. I read the letter through twice sitting at my kitchen table in the morning light, and when I finally set it down, I noticed that for the first time since that Thursday back in March, I did not feel any anger toward my children at all. I had not forgiven them, not fully, and perhaps I never entirely will, not all the way to the bottom. But I had found something near enough to peace to build a life inside of it. I have kept that letter. It is in the box under my bed, now the same box they emptied back in its place with Emmett's watch and the baby teeth and the small things a life leaves behind, because a letter like that belongs with the true things, not thrown away and not framed either, just kept. I do not read it often, but I take it out sometimes on the hard days, and I read the part where he writes that he means to become a man his mother would not be ashamed of, and I let myself believe it might be true. Not because I have proof that it is, but because a mother has to leave a door open somewhere, or she cannot go on living, and that letter is the door I have chosen to leave open. I do not know if my son will walk through it. Parole is coming, and after parole comes the rest of his life. And I have learned this year that I cannot control what other people do with the doors I leave open. I can only decide whether to leave them open at all. Opal left a door open for me. I have decided to leave one open for my son. What he does with it is his to answer for, not mine, but I will not be the one who closed it. I have closed enough doors in my life out of self-protection. This one I am leaving open, and I am at peace with it, whatever comes. It is a year now since I sold the land. My wrist healed slowly, and my ribs healed slowly, and I am back at my table in the morning light with a hem across my knees, and Waffle's warm chin resting on my foot exactly where it has always been. I turned 67 years old last month. The Opal Merrick Foundation has helped its first handful of young people find their footing under them, and there will be more, many more, for as long as there is money in that trust, which is to say for a very long time indeed. Colleen finished her ordered therapy sessions and then continued going by her own choice, and she is raising Junie and Cole alone now on a small income and a great deal of hard-won humility, and she is becoming, I will say it plainly, a far better mother than she ever was a daughter that spring. Wade will be up for parole soon, and I do not yet know whether the two of us will find our way back to each other or not, but I know that he is working, and working is a start, and a start is more than I had from him for a very long time. My grandchildren still come to me and their schooling is safe and always will be, and they will never know if I have anything at all to say about it how close their own father once came to taking it away from them. Colleen brings them out most Sundays now, and it has become the shape of my week, the thing I point myself toward. Junie is learning to sew alongside Destiny, the two of them at my table with their heads bent together over a scrap of cloth, and Cole would rather be down by the water hunting frogs, and I let him, because a boy should hunt frogs while he still wants to. And Colleen and I sit on the porch with our coffee while the children play, and we are careful with each other, the way you are careful with a thing that has been broken and mended and might break again along the old crack if you are not gentle. We do not talk about that spring. Not yet. Maybe someday. For now, we talk about small things, the children, the garden, a recipe, and the small things are enough. The small things are how you rebuild a thing that big, one small careful Sunday at a time. I have not told her the whole of what I understand about that spring, about how she used me and Trent used her, and how the cruelty ran in a straight line. She is not ready, and I am not sure she ever needs to hear it from me, because I think she is coming to understand it on her own, slowly in the therapy she keeps going to by choice. And a truth a person arrives at themselves goes down deeper than one that is handed to them. So I hold my peace and I pour the coffee, and I watch my granddaughter learn to sew a straight seam under the same patient hands that taught me. And I think that this right here, this careful mended Sunday quiet, is more than I ever thought I would have, again standing behind that maple tree with my heart slamming, and I am grateful for it in a way that has no bottom. And I have learned as one thing that I was too busy simply surviving to ever learn in all of my 66 years before this one. Money is not the most important thing that a person has. Self-respect is. I learned that it is not selfish to say no even to your own children, and maybe especially to your own children when saying yes would cost you the very person that you are. I learned that protecting what is yours does not make you hard or cold or mean. It makes you whole. And I learned lying flat on my own cold flagstones with my son being folded into the back of a police car that the most painful thing that ever happens to a person in this life can turn out to be the very thing that shows her at long last exactly who she is and exactly what she was always strong enough to do. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story, whether I regret it, whether I would do it all differently if I could go back. And I understand why they ask, because from the outside it looks like the money cost me my family, and what kind of a trade is that? An old woman alone with a foundation and a rescue dog and a cast on her wrist. But they have it backward, and I tell them so. The money did not cost me my family. The money only showed me with a terrible clarity what my family had already quietly become while I was busy paying the taxes and not asking for help and telling myself that no news was good news. The rot was already there. The money was just the light that finally fell on it. And I would rather stand in a hard, true light than sit forever in a comfortable, dark wondering. I have wondered enough in my life. I was a wondered-over child passed from house to house, wondering every single time whether this would be the family that kept me, and I am done wondering now. I know where I stand with every person in my life, which is a thing most people never get to know for certain, and I paid a high price for that certainty, but I do not regret paying it. A woman who knows exactly where she stands can build on that ground. A woman who does not is building on sand and does not find out until it all comes down. They thought they had cornered a lonely widow sitting on a pile of cash. What they never once understood is that the cash was never sitting there at all, that I had moved it beyond their reach before the first one of them ever came up my walk, that a woman who has raised herself up from nothing at all knows how to protect what matters long before anyone ever thinks to threaten it. They came to take everything away from a helpless old woman. They found out far too late that I was never helpless for a single day of my life, and that everything they wanted was already spoken for, already spent on saving children, just like the child I used to be. My name is Maribel Vance. I am 67 years old, and after a whole lifetime of valuing every single person above myself, I have finally learned at the very end of everything how to be worth as much to me as I was always worth to everyone else.